Hi there. Thanks for joining me. Now that we have made a great start with some basics of genetics, in particular by talking about cell division, let's take this topic a bit further. We will be applying all of our previous knowledge to understand how characteristics that are dependent on DNA are inherited and expressed. You might ask, why is this important? Well, knowing how genes are passed makes it possible to calculate probability that a certain trait appears. One of my all-time favorite reactions from students was when, after this class, one of my students came to tell me that this has completely changed her approach to dating. She continued telling me that there are so many things that I need to consider now if the genetic material of my date is suitable for what I want for my future child. Well, although that might not be exactly what we are after here, it is great to see when students find applications for all this knowledge that they learn in a class. But let's start with something that I really enjoy of talking about, and that is history of biology. And this guy, Mr. Mendel, is going to be a very important man for our story. So, who was Mendel? Well, he was an Austrian monk living in a monastery. And here you can see Mendel with his fellow monks in 1862. And he is circled here. You might be asked to pick him out from the crowd later on, so it pays off to watch these videos. So I guess that the question is, what do you do when you live in a monastery? It is a fairly simple life meant for focusing on things that are important, such as religious work. Well, it turns out that there is another thing you can do. You can study garden peas. You can even see him holding a plant here. How cute! But to be serious for a moment here, we must remember that at that time the monasteries played an important role in preserving and passing onwards scientific knowledge. In fact, many European universities have been built from former centers of religious work. And this includes one of my home universities. It really gives quite a sense of history to study and work at a site like that. In fact, they wanted to film a lot of the Harry Potter movies in here at the University of Glasgow, but we had to keep the university operational for its day-to-day activities, and we're not able to facilitate a lot of it. But as I said, monasteries were often places where important documents were preserved, copied, and studied. And they really made a significant contribution to the field of science, as we will see to be the case also in relation to Gregor Mendel. So, Gregor Mendel studied cotton peas as a model organism. And model organisms are organisms that we understand well, are easy to maintain, reproduce fast, and so on. Basically, they are something that makes it easy to study them, often their genetics. And by studying them, we can often learn more about some patterns in us humans. And some examples include, for example, fruit flies, yeast, that you know as baker's yeast. I have used a lot of pig hearts in my work in comparison to human heart, and so on. You can study these more independently. But what Mendel used for his work was garden peas, and he looked at various characteristics that are present in them. And what we have learned by now in our course is, of course, that these characteristics must originate from the parents. What Mendel was interested was how certain variations appeared among some individuals in the family, but not with all. And at this point, I do want to remind you that, for example, yes, two black parents can have a white child, or other way around. It's all about genetics and probabilities. Another thing that I do want to highlight here is that Mendel's findings were and still are very compatible with evolution. Remember, various combinations of characteristics appear naturally, and those that are favorable result in a greater reproductive success, and those are passed on. So why did Mendel choose to study these garden peas? Well, they are a great model organism. They are limited in the number of different characteristics. They are easy to grow. They reproduce at a fast rate. And importantly, it is possible for us to control what plant pollinates what plant. And that is exactly what Mendel did. Another thing to note is that Mendel chose carefully which varieties to use, and he studied simple traits. And in fact, Mendel had a strong background in mathematics. In fact, he studied at the University of Vienna. So he was able to analyze his findings and concluded a lot of probabilities of what we see and how we see them. In addition, Mendel was an excellent scientist and very strong at keeping records. Another thing that made him a great scientist is that he did conduct a lot of preliminary studies before the ones that we famously know about. So all that work that goes in before a main study is conducted in science is very important too. Don't forget that. When Mendel talked about evolution, he used a term minute particles. In fact, he said how there are these minute particles that must be passed from parents to the offspring. Of course, we now know that these are genes. So he really was ahead of his time. A long time before we even knew anything about genes. So let's look at a garden pea flower now and figure out that what Mendel did and how it works. So normally garden peas self-pollinate. This means that a flower has something that is equal to our sperm and egg cells. And sperm from one flower fertilizes an egg from the same flower. So this is what happens normally. But what Mendel did was rather clever. Remember, he wanted to control carefully that who was the father and who was the mother of a new individual. And he did this by eliminating the chance that a flower would pollinate itself. Instead, by being in full control of what plant pollinates what plant. How do you do that? Well, first of all, we prevent the chance of self-pollination by removing either the equal to a sperm or egg-producing structure of a flower. And then we collect pollen from one flower and using a paintbrush, move it from one plant to another in a controlled manner. And now we know who is the mother and who is the father. And because we know them, we can also know their phenotypic characteristics. This means we know exactly what they looked like, so we can start working out and predicting what their offspring will look like. And this is exactly what, for example, cat breeders would try to do. Look at that. I just got a new kitten. Isn't she cute? I just wanted to show a picture of her to you, really. So I wanted to make up a reason why to talk about cats in this talk. Really, let's get back to garden peas. There are two terms that are going to become very important for us to know. Genotype is the genetic components or build of an individual. You can think of it as what is coded in one's DNA and what defines a characteristic that one will have. Say like a blueprint for what one will be like. And phenotype is what we can actually see, what one turns out to be. Remember, we had 2 alleles for each gene, or in this case, you can think for each characteristic. You got one of them from your mother and one of them from your father. And we will come back to this concept in a little bit. But just remember that in this case, what is coded in the set of genetic instructions would be your genome. And what you will end up seeing, as this confident looking chap, is your phenotype. And in the next video, we are going to take this information and apply it as Mendel did. I look forward to seeing you then.